Let's get centered. This week, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth tells U.S. troops in Puerto Rico to prepare for war. Our special guest, Eric Farnsworth, who led the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the American Society for more than 22 years, joins us to discuss the Trump administration's posture in the Western Hemisphere and what it means for the region and our economy. And 24 years since the attacks of September 11th, 2001, a new landmark decision by a federal judge has allowed a lawsuit brought by families of 9/11 victims against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to move forward. I'm Louis Miranda alongside Carl Meacham. Eric Farnsworth will join us shortly, but first, we're recording this on a somber anniversary, a terrible moment that came to define so much of what America and the world would live through over the following decades. This morning, the bells rung at the memorial in New York City, marking the exact moments of the momentous events of that day. It's incredible to think that it's been 24 years, but we only left Afghanistan in 2021. And it was just this week that a federal judge ruled against a motion to dismiss a lawsuit that had been brought by families of 9/11 victims. The lawsuit focuses on Saudi Arabia because of allegations that the government there, or at least some members of that government, may have had links to some of the hijackers. Based on some new evidence that also emerged recently, as presented on CBS's 60 Minutes just a couple of months ago. Let me make clear that the Saudi government has denied that. And of course, relationships between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are somewhat close right now. I think the Trump administration has historically worked, both during Trump 1 and Trump 2, to have strong ties with Saudi Arabia. The suit had been temporarily dismissed in 2015, but Congress enacted a law in 2016 called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, and it allowed these kinds of lawsuits. It gave U.S. courts the jurisdiction over these types of suits when attacks occur on American soil. But still, this is hardly the end. Even if the lawsuit proceeds as it is now, the lawsuit itself has to play out in a trial. And it just shows how complicated the recovery from this terrible attack has been, and how the process of securing justice for the victims is not something that happens quickly. And we'll see this now play out in detail in the trial.
My thoughts are a little broader than just the trial. At the time, for some years, we've been commemorating 9/11, and I don't know when we stopped doing it. It used to be more of a fixation in the media. I think it's died down a little bit. I think now it's probably overtaken by our domestic crisis and polarization that we're facing. The feelings are are deep. At the time, we had an international threat with terrorism, Middle Eastern terrorism, extremism coming here to our city, right? And everybody at the time, the whole world was an American. I remember reading headlines from French newspapers, from Latin American newspapers, where the empathy, the sympathy for what had happened in New York City, for the towers coming down, for the plane crashing into the Pentagon, and the famous plane that was taken down in Pennsylvania. Those developments at the time were all coming from abroad. And now what we're dealing with, polarization and division from within. So there was sadness in 2001, 9/11, 2001, and there's sadness today. And
Yeah,
that's sort of at least how I feel.
I appreciate that. I think I all of us remember that day very clearly, who were obviously alive during that time. I think
Yeah.
one of the fascinating things is that it has been 24 years. So if you put that into context, the Kennedy assassination, which took place in 1963, November 22nd of 1963, 24 years later would have been November of 1987.
Wow.
And so that really shows you how distant it is of an event. And so, yeah, those of us who remember that day like it was yesterday, it doesn't feel like that. But for the American experience overall, for anyone who's under 24 years old, they weren't even alive. They hadn't been born then, and they've grown up in a different world. Somebody sent me a clip the other day of a high school cheering squad that had like a whole 9/11 recreation as part of their theme, and I think it was trying to be respectful. I don't think it was trying to mock it or in any way, but but it is a historical moment that is separate and distinct from what they see as today. Both good and bad. I think it's good because it shows that there's been healing and that it becomes a historical moment, and you can sort of refocus on the issues of the day. Um, but it's bad because it was a critical moment that also brought us together for a moment,
Yeah.
but that started to exacerbate certain differences about how we approach certain issues. And if you look at even the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, it has always had to toe that very difficult line between security and freedom, and it's not one that should be taken lightly. There is new technology. There were authorities under the Patriot Act. There's additional authorities that are necessary today, for example, to counter the escalating threat from drones. Drones can be a lot of fun, and you can get great pictures on them and everything, but in the hands of nefarious actors, they can become weapons. And so the balance between how do we keep America safe while protecting our civil rights and our civil liberties has been a tension ever since. And so I think we can't forget that either. And hopefully, as you pointed out, hopefully we can also find a way to bring back a little bit of that sense of unity that happened right after 9/11, where I think we all stood as one. I don't think that the divisions of the petty political stuff that happened day to day felt secondary or even tertiary and insignificant in that moment. And the victims of 9/11 were from all over the world. They were New Yorkers. They were from all over the country. There were migrant workers working in that building that day who also lost their lives. There were people from all over the world there. Today, President Trump and Secretary Hegseth spoke at the Pentagon Memorial.
Yeah.
Can't forget that. And of course, as you pointed out, Carl, the fourth plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. The never forget can't just be a trite term to feel anger. It should be about the resolve that we have to be united, but also the resolve that as a democracy, we have a responsibility to balance security and freedom, and that we have to have a responsibility to defend the founding principles of this country, even when it's uncomfortable. The assassination on Wednesday at a college campus in Utah of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, that was tragic and it was horrific. The motives are not known. Social media is doing what it does, fanning the flames. And so let me be clear, political violence has no place in our society. Our democracy depends on people being able to disagree, sometimes vehemently, without being attacked violently. And at the end of the day, Charlie Kirk was a father, a husband. His family should be holding him close today instead of mourning him. We have to lower the temperature of the political climate. Look, Charlie held strong to his beliefs, but he welcomed debate with those who disagreed with him. Let's just be clear: we condemn his assassination in the strongest terms. And look, I think I appreciate that what I've seen overall and overwhelmingly is that both Republican and Democratic leaders across the board have come out and condemned it as such. It's important to point out this is not an isolated incident. um, our country is enmeshed in a cycle of violence that is unacceptable. You saw it with the attack of Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. You saw it just earlier this year. We had a Minnesota state senator on to talk about the assassination of one of her colleagues and their spouse, and the shooting of another, who were targeted, very directly targeted for being leaders of that party in Minnesota. What our founding documents talk about, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, requires that we uh, learn how to disagree, and that's part of a democracy.
Yeah.
Freedom of speech. You can disagree. Somebody can say something that you think is ridiculous. Whatever the case might be, it doesn't matter which side it is. They have the right to have their opinion. The other thing is that this happened on a college campus, and it wasn't the only incident where students saw violence yesterday. There was a shooting also in Denver,
Yeah.
where a teenager shot two classmates at a high school. before turning the gun on himself. These are terrible, terrible situations that just also speak to the epidemic of gun violence in our country. And we deserve a serious debate on reducing gun violence as well.
And we can't assume on either side that we have all the answers. We have to have the conversation if we're going to make the American experiment work.
And hopefully Americans of all political persuasions will find a way to find common ground in the coming days.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're now joined by Eric Farnsworth, a longtime and trusted voice on hemispheric affairs. For more than 22 years, he led the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the American Society, and he's now a senior associate at CSIS. Eric also served at the White House, the State Department, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative. So there are few who follow the region with as much depth or credibility. And so, Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Well, Louise, thanks for having me, and really appreciate your kind introduction.
Yeah, no, and it's a real joy to have you, Eric. I mean, I've known you for like over 20 years now. And you've always been, a very sort of defining figure in the world that deals with Western Hemisphere in particular. I respect your views. They're generally ones that I agree with. And it's really exciting to be able to have you share with us here today. And a lot has happened in the region, but I just want to focus on a couple of things that I've read. Some of your opinions or things that have come out lately. There's one thing in particular that I read that I really enjoyed, which is your recent piece, "Is America Becoming Latin America?" And it struck a nerve. You argued that some of the same populist economic experiments that once set Latin America back are now being replayed here in DC. And it feels timely and sobering. I think the Western Hemisphere has endured a lot of turmoil before, authoritarianism, debt crisis, inequality, but it's also rebounded at different times. So I guess the question to sort of kick this off is, are we truly in uncharted territory now, or are we simply cycling back through familiar patterns? How do you see this?
Well, first of all, thanks for your comments as well. It's mutual respect and regard. So thanks for having me on your show. I really appreciate that. And, I agree. This is a bit of uncharted territory. The situation is evolving, both here domestically in the United States and certainly with the Western Hemisphere. I also want to thank you for reading that article, Carl. I'm not sure how many people actually read what you write, but and the general point was, Latin America has pursued a path for many years, more or less, right, with some alterations, and each country is different, of course. But broadly speaking, with strong executive, with fairly aggressive government engagement in the economy, with until relatively recently closed economies and the idea of import substitution. And, I hasten to say that those policies, broadly speaking, have been left by the wayside, at least economically, because they proved to be ineffective, but they linger, the effects linger, and Latin America's slow growth profile continues to haunt the region. And we've talked about lost decades for Latin America in the past. Well, that's not just the past, right? It's like William Faulkner, the past isn't past, it's here with us still, right? And so we're talking about another lost decade for Latin America. That's the backdrop that I argue that from the US perspective, we're raising tariff barriers. We're engaging directly in the economy with government stakes in Intel and, other potential US companies. Certainly, we have a strong executive, which is claiming authorities that we haven't seen an executive claim in the past to do some of these things, most notably the emergency powers under IEPA, which is an Emergency Powers Act for economic emergencies, and a Congress that is really saying, for the most part, we agree with your direction. And so you have a strengthening executive in a way that I think institutionally we haven't seen in the United States, at least in my memory. So the challenge here is, where do we go? What are the broader implications of this? But you're already starting to see people argue that we now have Peronism on the Potomac. And that's, and I directly compare it to where we could be going with Peronism. So that's something we have to watch closely, I think.
Yeah, Melania as Eva Trump, Eva Peron. One of the things that you probably get asked a lot is more along the lines of this. It used to be that experts in Washington D.C. were like on the region, right? Were asked about some problem happening in a country in the region, in Mexico or Brazil or Venezuela, right? And now it just seems like there's been sort of an inverse, right? Folks in the region are always asking us about what's happening here in the US, and they're making those parallels that you are. Let me delve into some of that more macro but Latin America stuff. You've said that real challenge for business, or the real challenge for business and policymakers in the region, is uncertainty. And you've talked a little bit about that, per a lot of the changes that are happening here in the US. But a big part of that also comes from China's expanding role. So let me ask you this. Is Washington losing the hemisphere to China? Not because China is stronger, but because the US is simply not showing up with a competitive alternative?
Well, I think you can clearly make that case. The Western Hemisphere, I would suggest, is not necessarily in love, quote unquote, with China or the Chinese experience or the Chinese model. But if you don't have any options, you don't have any options, right? And so that's something that you and I and many others have lamented, I think, for a long while, and it's a bipartisan failing. The lack of meaningful economic engagement in the region that we've seen is really a compelling indicator of interest, I think. And China has seen that, seen an opportunity, seen a vacuum, and has really gone in quite aggressively in terms of working on infrastructure development and providing investment in areas like 5G and things that the region needs. And, I have no problem comparing the US model to the Chinese model and coming out on top. I mean, I'll make that comparison every single minute of the day. Our system is better. But the region has to see that. They have to feel it. They have to receive some sort of benefit. Otherwise, it becomes just an academic discussion and an academic argument. If you're trying to feed your family, if you're trying to create jobs, if you're trying to get your kids to school safely, it doesn't really matter what system you're under if you can't do those sorts of things. And I'm being a little bit dramatic here to make the point, but so I think that on balance, sure, the region shares values with us. We share democratic values, we share similar aspirations and these sorts of things. But that need for engagement and to really show up in the region to work for mutual benefit, I think, is the key here that many in the region would want, and frankly, I think on a bipartisan basis has been lacking for a long time.
Yeah, Eric, we're seeing a lot here in the U.S. That being on the internet or in different feeds about terrible people being separated from families, etc. But in the rest of the country, and I'm just going to put it in a very blunt way. And in a lot of parts of the country, people are comfortable with getting rid of people that have come into the country illegally. I mean, obviously, there's a human imperative and there's a problem with separating families. But for a lot of the country, folks are thinking, this is an overdue issue. Congress has not been able to deal with this. And you're seeing Donald Trump deal with this issue. How do you see what we're doing with migration? How do you see that being viewed in the rest of the region?
No, simply to say that there has to be a balance. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Look, the United States is a country of migrants. We were built on migration, and we continue to need migrants for our own economic well-being. And I think every demographic projection indicates that migration will continue to be a critical aspect of U.S. well-being and growth well into the future, particularly as the baby boom generation really accelerates its retirement. But it has to be done in a balanced way. It has to be done according to the rule of law. And I think this is where many Americans find real reasons for criticism. And the photos that we've seen in previous years about, just floods of people just coming across the border unregulated en masse and Accusations can fly and all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, there has to be a more orderly process. And so, you can overreact on both sides. And I think that's it's an easy issue to demagogue, but I think you have to really recognize what the impact is, what the value is of orderly migration, and then work toward that. But I totally agree with you, Carl. This is such a complicated issue, and at one level it stems from a very good place. That is that many people in the world want to live in the United States. That's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Our economy is stronger, quality of life is better, many things that draw folks toward the United States, and I think that's a real positive. But again, we have to do it in a balanced way, and you're not going to sustain support for migration if it's not.
And it does have to be dealt with in an economic way, because that's the part that just doesn't get talked about enough, is just that at the end of the day, people are coming because there's jobs that are being created that need that type of worker. And we've not created the mechanisms to really handle that flow. And so that goes to the flip side of what I wanted to ask you, which is that across the region, how long can this, and I don't want to call it zero, because the reality is it hasn't been zero migration. We had looked at the numbers a couple weeks ago, and it was something like 23,000 people have crossed illegally in just the prior 3 months, and another 10,000 or so showing up at ports of entry. And so the number's never been zero. The borders are not effectively closed. There's certainly been a deterrence. But how long do you think that this low can hold, considering that there's going to continue to be both economic demand on both sides?
Well, pressure builds up, and once it does, at some point the lid blows. Every amateur cook can tell you that. But I think the U.S. administration has clearly committed its intent to continue to harden the border. And so I think those low numbers are going to continue in some way, but there will be pressure building up in the United States itself, not necessarily from the region, but in the United States, to say, from the business community, we need workers. And it's not just, some company here or there. It's whole sectors, right? It's the agriculture sector. It's the hospitality sector. It's the meatpacking sector. If you go to the Midwest, where I'm from originally, if you go to meatpacking locations in Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Arkansas, these are fully staffed with migrant labor. It's hard work. It's nasty work. I would suggest not work I would want to do, and it's necessary work. And so, you put all those things together, where does the workforce come from? You get folks who are willing to migrate and take those jobs. If you then begin to really clamp down on labor, on immigration completely, whether legal or illegal, then where do you get those jobs filled from? And that affects the supply chain, it affects the food chain, it affects, frankly, consumer prices. And at some point, the American citizens, just the general populace, says, wait a minute, something here is broken. And that's where I think you begin to get, get some changes. But that takes a while to build up. Those inefficiencies and those broken supply chains begin to accumulate, but it takes a while, and the political process has to keep up.
Yeah, and a lot of people are self-deporting, or sending their moving backwards. Some of them are trying to avoid the Darien by starting to take boats from further north in Panama to Colombia through much more treacherous waters. And the other question that I think has to be considered on that is, are all of these places equipped for this sudden surge of people back? And it may not seem like significant numbers, but Colombia is one example, just having had already absorbed probably 3 to 4 million Venezuelans. What happens now as more and more people go back to places where they may not be ready to handle them either?
It's a real question. And, a country like Mexico, which normally in the past has been a pass-through country. You don't just have Mexican citizens coming to the U.S., you have Central Americans and others going through Mexico on the way to the United States. Now you've got Mexico is a destination country, because if they can't get to the U.S., then they become bottled up in Mexico. And so that puts additional pressure on Mexico in particular. So I think it even amplifies the point you're making, Luis, and I think it's exactly right.
Let me move a little bit to an issue that we're both really interested in and focused on, or have been focused on for years, which is Venezuela. You have had a very clear set of opinions for years, and we've watched how this situation has just, it's the kick the can foreign policy that we've seen, from Bush to Obama to, well, I think it was more defined during Trump one with Guaido maybe, and there was a lot of bipartisan support. Back to Biden, and I think there were some efforts made, rhetorical, but I don't really think that changes occurred. I think there was a lot of questions, particularly on things like Chevron, the relationship with Chevron, and now here we are again with Donald Trump, and the efforts that he's making. Gunboat diplomacy. We've seen some actions in the Caribbean. What do you make of all this? You've been watching this for years, Eric, and we have not really had a defined approach to dealing with Venezuela, with Chavez or Maduro. What is your sort of big picture observation on where we are and where we could be and what we should be doing?
Yeah, it's just such a complicated issue, and you're right. We've been watching it for a long time, and here we are still talking about it.
That's
So
right.
we'll probably be talking about it another few years from now, but who knows?
Yeah.
Big picture is that the Venezuelan people are desperate for change.
Yeah.
They have voted literally in elections on July 28th, 2024, overwhelmingly for opposition defeating Nicolas Maduro, despite all the advantages arrayed against them in terms of state funding of the state candidate, in terms of gamesmanship with voting lists, in terms of restrictions on the press, and most egregiously, the arbitrary disqualification of leading opposition candidate Maria Corina Machado as presidential candidate. The opposition quickly reinvented themselves under the leadership of Edmundo Gonzalez, and he was elected overwhelmingly, and so the Venezuelan people have voted for change. As Luis was also indicating in the migration discussion that we were having, many Venezuelans have voted for change by leaving the country as well. So a country that at one point was about 33 million people has lost upwards of 8 million of its own people, and they've gone, to the region, to the United States, elsewhere. But the point is that a quarter of Venezuelans' own citizens have said that the situation is bad enough that they have to leave everything and start over somewhere else. So, you take those indicators that the Venezuelan people themselves want change, but the regime is so entrenched through oppression, through corruption, through control of the security and military forces that it doesn't see any need for changes, and it doesn't intend to go anywhere. That's kind of the baseline for me. And then the question that you raised, Carl, I think is quite right. So what does that mean for the United States? Well, this is the key question. So laying out what I think would probably be good for the Venezuelan people is a democratic change, which they voted for. But what is best for the United States? And I think that's the question that the US president and US Congress really have to answer. In other words, what should compel us to do? And I think support for democracy is critical. I think it continues to be, it needs to be, particularly in the Western Hemisphere context. I think support for the opposition. I think sanctioning the individuals at the top of the hierarchy in Venezuela is critical in terms of their assets and the assets of their supporters and family and folks like that, and ways to try to divide folks if in the security forces from the regime itself. And I think all those things have been done and are being done and are being tried. What the Trump administration has done differently, what the different approach here, is that they've declared drug cartels now as international terrorist organizations, and said that Nicolas Maduro is the head of an international terrorist organization. And by doing that, it provides the United States with different authorities, particularly on the military side, to be able to go after narco traffickers because they've been declared as terrorists. And that's what has brought the U.S. Navy into the region, or more aggressively into the region, and certainly building up right now in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the region. And that's a departure. That is the change. The question on the minds of many people, and I think it's a legitimate question, is: are these assets really for narco trafficking,
right,
or are they there for some bigger mission? And I think that remains to be seen. I have no problems going after narco traffickers at all. I mean, these are bad folks. We have legal authorities and Coast Guard assets and folks like that to be able to do that. I think the question is, what's a mission, a legitimate and appropriate mission for military assets in the region? And I think that's an open question. So those are some of the things that I think people are trying to wrestle with. Look, the Maduro regime is involved in narco trafficking. There is a Cartel de los Soles. They are involved in some really bad things. So I don't think it's a clear-cut issue as some people on, either side are making it. They're really difficult issues here, and they need to be thought through. But I think they need to be thought through in a careful way, and not just develop facts on the ground and then try to perhaps justify actions post hoc or something like that. I think there has to be a thoughtful approach from the beginning.
Yeah. And if it does become either a stated or just de facto regime change mission, and you do get that, what's the potential there for even more lack of stability and chaos?
Well, absolutely. And look, Venezuela is a large country. Most folks in North America just don't realize how big most of the countries of South America really are. I mean, Carl, you live there, you know the region. Luis, you know the region. I mean, these are really large countries. And the example of Panama in 1989 frequently comes up. Panama is a country literally 1/10 the size of Venezuela, a country that the U.S. military had active bases in, that we had been involved with for 100 years. We knew the country intimately. And the example is different. I mean, Venezuela is much larger. Much of the country is not governed right now by the de facto regime. It's lawless, right? There are Colombian guerrillas, FARC, ELN guerrillas running around. There are certainly drug traffickers. There are illegal miners. There are whole communities that the government really has no writ over. And then there are militias and folks who may be loyal to the regime. They may not, but unless that's tested, you wouldn't really know. The point that I'm making is just to confirm, Luis, what you're suggesting. It would be a really complicated thing. But having said that, I don't really get the sense sitting here in Washington in the middle of September right now that anybody is gaming out a U.S. invasion or takeover of Venezuela. The assets don't suggest that. The rhetoric coming from the White House doesn't suggest that. The president's own record would not suggest that in terms of some of the actions he's taking, whether it's Iran or the Houthis or folks like that. So I think there are options between purely drug trafficking or drug eradication and military invasion. And so I think that's the latter that we kind of have to look at and see, okay, well, what does the administration intend on doing along those lines? And frankly, what would be the best for U.S. interests? And I keep coming back to that. Yeah. I get it from the Venezuelan side. I fully support that. I mean, Carl knows that. I fully support the Venezuelan opposition and their efforts. But the U.S. president is elected to represent U.S. interests. And I think we have to keep that in mind in terms of trying to figure out what the United States might do.
And let me ask you this question to make it really simple for you. For years, and we talked about this with John Feely, with Ambassador Feely last week, but for years, I think you and I and others would complain the region doesn't get enough attention, the region doesn't get enough resources. No one cares about the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and the foreign policy establishment. We finally have had more interest in the Western Hemisphere. But is this the kind of interest that we want? Is there a silver lining that you see here, Eric? And I know I ask you this because you're a middle of the road person like me and Luis. We're trying to see what the positives are from this situation. It's hard to find them, Luis, but what the positives are from the current approach to Latin America. Do you feel that this attention that the region's getting now it has positive aspects, or are we really sort of stuck in this new environment of sphere of influence, expansionism to different places, including Greenland, and then politics by tariffs? How do you see the positives here?
I think it's a really good question, and that aspect can easily be overlooked. And I would hasten to say that there are a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere who are cheerleaders for the U.S. approach in the region and want more of it. Counter drugs. I mean, you saw when the narcotics trafficking boat was destroyed by the United States, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago came out in public and said, "That's great. Let's see more of this."
Yeah.
The President of Ecuador has said, "We need U.S. assets in Ecuador to address the crime and security issues that are troubling us." And down the line, I mean, you've seen a number of leaders. Now, not all leaders, but it's not the cut and dried issue that you might have in an academic salon or something, or the days of the 1950s or something like this. It's changed because people are desperate in the region. They're desperate to get rid of the crime that has just changed their lives. They're desperate to get rid of the narcotics trafficking. And so I think some of that attention is frankly probably healthy. But there is a way to do this, and there's a way not to do it. And I think the region has to be a partner in its own future. And to me, this is, to come back to the Venezuela side, it would be a whole lot more sustainable to approach Venezuela if we were able to do it in conjunction and coordination with real friends and allies who we have developed those relationships with over years, right? So it's not just an opportunity to say, okay, come be with us here, and then tomorrow we'll talk about something else. No, as true friends and allies, you recognize that there is a cancerous narco regime in Caracas that needs to be addressed. How do you do that? Well, if the neighbors and the friends around in the region are supportive of a more aggressive action, then it's a more sustainable approach, and I think ultimately a better approach. But if you're engaged in tariff wars, or if you're engaged in rhetorical battles, or discussions in ways that are ultimately not that important, but are getting leading the news cycle, then it's a lot harder for countries in the region to cooperate with the United States. And that, I think, is the key, right? How are we addressing the longer term issues in terms of our shorter term actions? So these are real. I do think, though, that going back to your question, attention in the region is healthy. The Secretary of State's been in the region in the first 6 months already 3 times. Wow. Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, of course, one after another, high level, sub-cabinet level, and others have been in the region. That is a fundamental shift. We'll see if it continues at the Summit of the Americas in December in Santo Domingo, Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. But for the moment, there's an intense amount of attention. How can that attention be best harnessed in a way that is building those relationships for the longer term and really supports broader U.S. interests? I think that's the question.
Yeah, and let me ask you this, because and I know we're coming up on the time here, so just to get kind of this I guess a little bit of a lighter note, but there's been not uncommon to hear Latin Americans joke about the United States of Latin America, and really pointing to what is creeping authoritarianism, inequality, a sense that there's the corruption that would be more akin of a banana republic than of the shining city on the hill. Is the region really seeing it as satire, or is there a real concern that the United States of America is falling into a cycle of decline and along the lines of what we've seen in Latin America?
Well, the power of example really does matter. And in many ways, the region has looked to the United States, sometimes reluctantly, as a positive example, both for democracy and certainly economic growth and quality of life. And we've talked about that from the migration side. Yes, there are certain, folks who from an ideological perspective will take a different position. But if you ask people broadly in the Western Hemisphere, I think that power of example is still compelling and would draw many folks toward the United States approach on many things. But you can't take that for granted. I mean, that's something that can erode and corrode. And I think we've seen some real changes in U.S. society that you allude to, and I think those are points of real concern for many people in the Western Hemisphere. It's the definition of democracy, the definition of corruption is different from country to country. But it's like, the old Supreme Court justice talking about, obscenity. I know it when I see it, right? So there's a sense of, what is really should be allowed in a democratic environment, and then things that go beyond that. And I think everybody has their own example and their own definition. But once we start getting up to that point or crossing it, yeah, that's when the power of example really corrodes in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Eric, I know we're right on time here, so I really appreciate you joining us.
It's great to have an opportunity, Eric, to talk with you. Again, so much of these conversations these days get lost in the polarization. And I think you've always been someone that I've respected a lot in Washington, D.C., that's willing to, really have the conversation, regardless of where you might fall on what side, as long as it's, advancing U.S. interests, which is something that I think should be the guiding principle in our policies towards the region. But it's just been great to talk with you and to be your friend for like 20 years.
And to hear your calming perspective in tumultuous times.
Well, you both are generous to me, and I really appreciate that. But sincerely, thanks for the invitation. It's great to join both of you, and best of luck as you continue taking over the world with this podcast. I really look forward to see what you do with it. So well done.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I thought it was a great discussion on a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention. The Western Hemisphere is not just a backyard. It is not an afterthought to the issues that often take more of the front page coverage that happen in Europe. It's Mexico's our number one trading partner. The region is incredibly intertwined in so many different ways. We have to find a way forward there as well. So it was a great conversation, and very, very happy that we were able to have that. And we'll be back next week. Thank you for your support. Our panel featured Louis Miranda, former Obama White House communications advisor and former spokesperson at DHS, Carl Meacham, former Clinton appointee and a former senior Republican staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Jerry Murphy, former CBS executive, author, and publicist.